Falcon drew blood again. It happened before the sun cleared the tree line, while most of the Ashcroft estate still slept. Henry Cole, the head falconer, a thick-armed man with 20 years of experience and not 1 ounce of embarrassment about backing down from a difficult animal, stood outside the mews pressing a cloth to his hand. His third finger was torn open from the knuckle to the nail. The wound was clean, precise, and completely intentional. The bird had seen his hand coming and made a choice. Edmund Hartwell, the 5th Duke of Ashcroft, stood beside him in his riding coat and said nothing for a long moment. He was 41 years old, lean in the way that men who ride every morning are lean, with gray beginning at his temples, and a way of holding his jaw that made it difficult to tell whether he was thinking or angry. Usually it was both. "Same spot?" Edmund asked. "Same spot," Cole said. "I tried the long glove this time. It did not care." Edmund looked through the mews gate at the bird inside. The Saker falcon sat on its perch in the gray morning light, perfectly still, its pale gold feathers giving it the look of something carved rather than living. It wore a hood, a small leather cap over its head that blocked its vision, and yet, it managed to convey the impression that it could see everything anyway. It was an extraordinary animal. It had cost more than Cole earned in 3 years. It had been in Edmund's possession for 4 months, and in that time it had refused to step onto a glove, refused to eat from a hand, refused to fly from a lure, and refused every attempt at anything that might be called cooperation. It had simply sat on its perch and endured its captivity with the quiet fury of something that knew it was built for open sky. Edmund had wanted this falcon since he first saw its kind in drawings from the Eastern Territories. There was something about the way Sakers flew, low and fast and absolutely committed, nothing decorative about it, that he found honest in a way he rarely found anything honest. He had paid a considerable sum to have this one brought from the open plains. He had brought in Cole, who was considered the finest falconer in the county. He had given them the best mews on the estate, fresh meat every morning, clean water, and careful handling every day without exception. The bird hated all of it. "What do we do?" Cole asked, still pressing the cloth to his hand. Edmund had no answer. He stood watching the falcon on its perch, and the falcon, despite its hood, despite the impossibility of it, seemed to turn its head toward him in a way that felt less like awareness and more like contempt. He had spent 4 months trying, 4 months of rising early, of reading everything available on Saker falcons and their temperament and their long history on the open steppes, of paying Cole's wage and the veterinary fees and the cost of the fresh quail the bird preferred and still refused to take from a human hand. He was not accustomed to failing. This was not arrogance, it was simply the truth of a life in which enough money and enough effort had, until now, always produced a result eventually. The falcon seemed entirely uninterested in this principle. "Let it be for today," Edmund said finally. "Let it rest." Cole nodded, relieved. He wrapped his hand in a cleaner cloth and walked toward the main stable. Edmund stayed a moment longer at the gate. He had a meeting with his estate manager at 8, correspondence from London he had been avoiding for a week, and a ride he had promised himself after breakfast. He had no reason to keep standing at the mews gate in the cold morning air watching a bird that wanted nothing from him. He stayed for another 10 minutes anyway. He was still there when he heard soft footsteps on the gravel path behind him. He turned, expecting Cole returning, or one of the stable hands. Instead, he found a young woman he had never noticed before, carrying a large ash bucket in both hands, making her way along the service path that ran behind the mews toward the kitchen garden. She had her head slightly down, watching the path for ice patches, and she did not immediately notice him standing off to the side of the gate. When she did notice him, she stopped. She looked at him directly, not with the quick drop of the eyes that most of the staff used when they found themselves accidentally near the Duke, but with a straightforward, calm look, as if she were simply registering information and deciding what to do with it. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, in a voice that was plain and even. "I did not know you were here." "Obviously," Edmund said, not unkindly. "Who are you?" "Mirabas, sir. I came on in January. Kitchen work mostly, and helping with the fires in the East Wing." Edmund looked at her for a moment. She was a slight woman, with dark hair pulled back simply, and her coat was too thin for the cold, and her boots had been repaired so many times that the repairs had their own repairs. She held the ash bucket without strain, which told him she carried it every morning. Her hands were red from cold and work, and her expression was neither frightened nor performing. It was just the face of someone who was there, present, not constructing anything. "Carry on," he said, and turned back to the mews. He heard her footsteps resume on the gravel. Then they stopped. He turned again. She had paused at the mews gate, not close, a few feet back from the wooden slats, but she had stopped walking, and was looking through the gate at the falcon. She was not making any sound. She was not reaching toward it. She was simply standing there with her ash bucket, looking at the bird. And the remarkable thing, the thing Edmund noticed with a precision he would think about for days afterward, was that she looked at it the way you look at something you find genuinely interesting and have no particular wish to own. The falcon had gone very still. Edmund watched. He had spent 4 months watching people approach that bird, and the approach always had the same quality. There was always something wanting in it, some forward lean, some reaching quality even when the body was held carefully back. Cole approached it like a professional, which meant with a kind of practiced clinical expectation. Edmund himself had approached it with something he was not quite willing to name. Every groom, every stable hand, every visiting gentleman who had tried his luck had brought something to the Mews gate. Some need, some agenda, some picture in their head of what success looked like and what it would mean for them. This young woman stood with her ash bucket and seemed to want nothing from the bird at all. The falcon turned its hooded head toward her. It was a small movement, barely perceptible. But Edmund had watched this bird for 4 months, and he had never seen it make that particular movement. The slight tilt, the settling of the feathers, the way the body eased by a fraction on the perch. It was not fear. It was not the aggressive alertness it brought to everyone else. It was attention of a completely different kind. The kind of attention you pay to something that is not a threat and not a demand and not trying to be anything other than what it already is. Mira Boss stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she picked up her ash bucket and kept walking toward the kitchen garden, as if she had simply paused to rest her arms. She did not look back. She did not look toward Edmund. She went about her morning the same way she had clearly been going about her morning since January, quietly, without ceremony, in the cold before anyone was paying attention. Edmund stood at the Mews gate for a long time after she had gone. The falcon had returned to its usual stillness, but it had tilted its head. That small, precise, unmistakable tilt. Edmund had watched horses settle for particular stable hands, had watched dogs cross a full room to find the one person in it they trusted, had seen animals make choices that seemed to cut straight through the logic of training and handling, and go directly to something that could not be taught, or manufactured, or explained in any textbook on falconry. He had simply never expected to see it happen at his Mews gate, at 6 in the morning, in the presence of a kitchen girl with a bucket of ash. He went in for breakfast. He ate without tasting anything. He had his meeting with the estate manager, who spoke about fencing repairs and the winter hay supply, and an issue with the eastern tenant farms, and Edmund gave all the appropriate answers while some part of his mind sat quietly at the Mews gate in the cold, watching a bird turn its head toward a person who had not asked it to. That evening, he asked the housekeeper about Mira Boss. The housekeeper's name was Dorothy Finn, a careful woman who had managed the Ashcroft household for 11 years. And who took her responsibilities seriously enough to know everything about everyone under her roof. She gave Edmund the brief facts. Mira Boss was 22. Her father had worked on the Ashcroft estate 20 years ago, breaking horses for the previous duke, until he died of fever when Mira was 12. Her mother had taken work in the village, and died 2 winters ago. Mira had been in service at a house in the next county, and came to Ashcroft when 3 housemaids were taken ill in January. She had been doing kitchen and firework since then. She was quiet. She was reliable. She gave no trouble. Edmund listened to all of this with his hands folded on his desk. "Does she have family left?" he asked. "Not that I know of, Your Grace." "And she is well treated here?" Dorothy Finn paused in the way that careful women pause when they are deciding which version of the truth is appropriate. "She works hard, sir. Everyone works hard." Edmund let that answer sit where it landed. "Thank you, Mrs. Finn." After the housekeeper left, he sat in his study for a while in the dark, which was something he occasionally did when he was trying to think something through without the pressure of appearing to think it through. His father had owned the falcon's ancestor, a lesser bird, a British-bred hawk that flew competently and never gave any trouble. Edmund remembered watching his father hunt with it as a boy, the clean release, the arrow flight, the return. It had been impressive. It had also been entirely predictable, and Edmund had always been faintly bored by things that were entirely predictable, though he had never been quite rude enough to say so to his father. He thought about the bird turning its head this morning, the precise, quiet tilt, like a compass finding north, like recognition between 2 things that had not yet been formally introduced. He thought about a young woman with a too-thin coat and an ash bucket stopping at a Mews gate because something in her simply stopped, not planning to stop, not choosing to make an impression, just stopping the way you stop when something real is in front of you, and your body understands it before your mind does. The fire in the study burned low. Edmund did not add wood to it. He was already thinking about the morning. The sun was barely above the horizon when Mira set out from the kitchen the next day with her ash bucket. The east wing fireplaces went cold overnight and needed clearing by 6 so the fires could be rebuilt before the family came down. She had done this every morning since January. She knew every stone on the service path, every patch where ice collected after a night's freeze, every gate latch that stuck in cold weather and had to be lifted before it would open. She had not planned to stop at the Mews the day before. She had not known the Duke was standing there. She had simply been walking, and the bird had caught her eye through the wooden slats, the pale, still shape of it in the morning gray, and something in her had slowed in the same way it always slowed when she encountered something that was very quiet and very alone. She had grown up around animals. Her father had a gift for them that he had never named, had never tried to teach, had simply demonstrated every morning of her childhood by the way he moved through a stable. None of the horses shifted away from him. He had a way of arriving near a frightened animal that communicated nothing threatening, not dominance, not patience performing as patience, just genuine presence. She had watched him stand near a horse that had thrown 3 men, stand near it for an hour without touching it or speaking to it, just existing beside it in a way that said, "I am not a threat. I am not a demand. I have nowhere else I need to be." The horse had eventually put its nose against his shoulder. Her father had smiled. He had not said anything. He had simply stood there with the horse's nose against his shoulder and let it be what it was. She had not thought about that memory in a long time. She thought about it now as she turned onto the service path and the Mews gate came into view in the early light. The Duke was not there this morning. The path was empty. She shifted the ash bucket to her left hand and kept walking, and then she stopped at the gate. The Falcon sat on its perch in the same position it had occupied the previous morning, hood on, feathers settled, completely still in the way that wild things are still, not the stillness of something resting, but the stillness of something that is always, at every moment, ready. She looked at it through the wooden slats and said nothing and did nothing and made no move toward it. The Falcon tilted its head, the same small movement as the morning before, toward her, not toward the gate, not toward the sound of the wind moving through the elm trees, not toward the rooks beginning to call from the roof of the stable, toward her, specifically, with a precision that had nothing accidental in it. Mira stood for a moment longer. Then she picked up her bucket and went to clear the fires. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She did not tell anyone because there was no one to tell. The kitchen staff were pleasant enough, but they kept to themselves. And Mira had learned in her years of service that the quieter you were about something that mattered to you, the longer it remained yours. She simply came to the gate each morning and stood and looked at the bird and let the bird look back at her, in whatever way it managed to sense her presence through the leather of its hood. On the 5th morning, Henry Cole came around the corner of the Mews while she was standing at the gate and stopped short at the sight of her. "What are you doing?" he said, not unkindly, but with the wariness of a man who had a great deal invested in an animal that had already caused him pain. "I was just looking," Mira said. "I hope that is all right." Cole looked at her, looked at the bird, looked back at her. The Falcon had done that tilt again, that small, precise movement toward the girl that it never made for anyone else. He had been trying to attribute it to something explainable. A smell from the kitchen fire she carried on her clothes, a frequency in her footsteps, some mechanical and ordinary thing that a professional could account for. Standing here watching it happen in front of him, he found that no explanation satisfied him. "Do not go near the gate," he said, finally. "Do not reach through the slats. Do not make any sudden noise near it. It is a dangerous bird, and it has already done enough damage this month." "I know," Mira said. "I will not." Cole walked past her and into the Mews to check the water and the morning meat. When he came back out, she was gone. He stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the Falcon. It had turned its head back to its forward position, hooded, still, seeing nothing, and apparently aware of everything. "What is it about her?" Cole asked the bird, which offered nothing in return. But he did not tell her to stop coming. He watched her for the next week from a careful distance. He was a man who believed in observation before opinion. He had spent his career studying the behavior of birds that most people found incomprehensible, and he had learned that the most useful thing you could do with a complicated animal was watch it long enough to understand what it was actually responding to, rather than what you assumed it should be responding to. What Mira Boss did near that Falcon was almost nothing. She stood, she breathed. She made no attempt to impress the bird and no attempt to manage it. She did not use the soft, coaxing voice that well-meaning people use near animals. The voice that was meant to be soothing but was almost always thin with wanting. She did not make herself small in the way people make themselves small when they are trying to trick an animal into trusting them by appearing harmless. She was simply present, fully and honestly present, with no other agenda visible anywhere on her. On the 11th morning, the Falcon stepped sideways along its perch. 3 small steps to the right, closing the distance between itself and the section of the mews nearest the gate where Mira stood each morning. Cole, watching from inside the stable doorway, noted it in his handling log with a slightly unsteady hand. Because in 4 months of daily work, careful, professional, experienced work, this bird had never voluntarily moved toward anything. On the 14th morning, Mira arrived at the mews to find Cole waiting just inside the gate with a small piece of raw meat in his hand, and an expression she could not entirely read. "Take this," he said, holding the meat out through the slats to her. "Hold it flat on your palm. Do not curl your fingers. Do not move your hand when the bird approaches." Mira set down her ash bucket. She took the meat and held it exactly the way he described. Flat, open, steady. Cole unlatched the gate and opened it enough for her arm to pass through to the inside, and she held her hand still in the cold air of the mews. The Falcon was motionless for a long moment. Then it stepped from its perch onto the wooden block beneath it. Then, with the precise and unhurried movement of something that is decided, it stepped to the ground and walked across the mews floor toward Mira's hand. It moved the way she did, she thought, without performance, without hurry, without any gap between what it was doing and what it was. It ate the meat from her palm. Not tentatively, not in the quick, panicked grab of an animal taking a risk. It ate with the calm authority of something that had made a decision and was now simply acting on it. Cole stood with his arms at his sides and breathed very slowly and said nothing at all, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already communicated with more precision than any words he owned. Mira looked at the bird on her hand and felt the warmth of its feet through her skin and the surprising lightness of it, and thought about her father in a dim stable, with his hand resting against the nose of a horse that had decided to stop being afraid. She thought, yes, this is the thing he knew. This is what he could never explain because it was not something you explained. It was something you did or you did not do, and you either understood why it worked or you did not, and understanding why was not actually necessary. She was still thinking about this when she became aware of someone standing at the mews gate. The Duke. He was watching from the gate with his hands at his sides and an expression that she found difficult to interpret because it contained several things at once, things that seemed to be in conversation with each other in a way she did not feel she had the right to name yet. He was looking at her and at the bird, and the expression was not the satisfaction of an owner whose property had finally come right. It was something quieter and more personal. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who had just understood something he had been working toward for a long time, and was not entirely sure whether the understanding was a relief or the beginning of something harder. She did not know how long he had been there. The Falcon finished the meat. It stood on her palm for another moment, its small talons resting light against her skin. Its hooded head tilted in that direction she had come to understand meant, "You are here, and I know you are here, and that is a sufficient reason for me to remain." Then it stepped back onto the wooden block and walked back to its perch and settled its feathers and was still. Mira lowered her hand. She looked at the Duke. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Then she picked up her ash bucket and walked back to work. The east wing fires would not clear themselves, and the morning was already moving whether or not either of them was ready for it. Cole latched the gate. He looked at Edmund, who was still watching the path Mira had taken down the gravel serviceway. "She has what cannot be taught," Cole said quietly. Edmund said nothing. He stood at the gate for a moment longer, watching the empty path. Then he went in for breakfast. Whether he tasted any of it, he did not afterward remember. He thought about Cole's words for the rest of the morning. What cannot be taught? He had spent his life in a world where everything was taught: the management of land, the conduct of correspondence, the precise degree of distance appropriate between a duke and those in his employment. He had been taught all of it with considerable thoroughness and had found, at the far end of the teaching, that knowing the rules of a thing and being at home in the thing were two very different conditions. He thought about the Falcon stepping across the mews floor. The unhurried precision of it, the complete absence of performance on both sides, the bird going toward the hand because it had decided to, the girl holding the hand steady because she understood that steadiness was the only thing being asked of her. No technique, no calculation, just the willingness to be present without wanting anything from the moment except the moment itself. He thought, I wonder if I have ever done anything without wanting something from it. It was a disconcerting thought. He set it aside to be examined later when he was not standing at a mews gate in the cold watching an empty service path. That afternoon he found Cole in the stable and asked him directly what it would require to involve Mira in the bird's training formally. Not in the early mornings that no one had officially acknowledged, properly, with time set aside, with Cole's instruction, with the structure and knowledge that would keep both her and the bird safe. Cole set down the tool he had been cleaning and was quiet for a long moment. "She is a kitchen girl," he said. It was not an objection so much as a clear-eyed statement of the complication involved. "I am aware of what she does in the house," Edmund said. "Working with a falcon of this kind requires knowledge, experience, years of careful practice. She managed in 14 mornings what we could not manage in 4 months, Edmund said. He said it without pleasure, simply as the fact it was. Cole turned the tool over in his hands. Something moved in his jaw, the particular movement of a man working through something that costs him personally, something that asks him to set aside his own investment in the situation and look at what is actually true. He was capable of this. It was part of what made him good at his work, this capacity to prefer what was real over what was convenient. "Right," he said finally. "I will start her tomorrow." Cole was true to his word. He began the next morning and he took it seriously, because it was his profession, and seriousness was what the profession deserved. He sat with Mira in the mews before the handling session and talked about the falcon's history, what was known of it, how it had come from the open steppes, how Saker falcons lived and hunted and moved through the world, what they needed and what they resented. He talked about jesses and hoods and perches, about the hierarchy of trust and how it was built, about the patience required and the vigilance, and the constant daily attention to small signals. Mira listened the way she did everything, completely, without interrupting, asking questions only when she had thought about them first and was sure they were the right questions. Cole found, after the first week, that her questions were consistently the right questions. She asked about the things that mattered rather than the things that were impressive, which was the mark of someone who had already understood what the work was fundamentally about and was now filling in the specific technical knowledge around that understanding. He had taught apprentices before. 2 of them over his career had been good. 1 had been very good. Mira Boss, he concluded by the end of the first month, was in a different category, not because of what she knew, which she was still learning, but because of what she already was, which was something that could not be added by teaching, because it had to already be present. She was absolutely unafraid of the falcon. Not recklessly unafraid, she was careful, she was attentive, she respected what the bird was capable of and handled it accordingly. But the baseline of her presence near it was not fear. It was something more like recognition, 2 creatures in the same space, both with their own nature, both willing to acknowledge the others. The falcon responded to every session with Mira the way it had responded to nothing and no one else, with a willingness to engage. It was not sudden transformation. It was steady, incremental progress, the kind that comes from genuine trust being built rather than compliance being extracted. Each morning that Mira came, the bird was a fraction more settled. Each session produced something small and new, a longer time on the arm, a quicker step to the glove, a reduction in the tense alertness that had characterized its behavior from the day it arrived. Cole noted all of it in his handling log. The log was filling up in ways it had never filled before. Agnes, the cook, had worked in great houses for 30 years. She had seen a great deal and she was not the kind of woman who said this out loud, because it was obvious to anyone who looked at her, built into the economy of her movements, into the particular quality of her silences, into the way she stood at her kitchen window and watched the world outside it, without being surprised by anything she saw. She had been watching the situation at Ashcroft develop since early spring, and she had watched it with the attention of someone who has seen this particular kind of beginning before, and knows with considerable accuracy where it tends to end. She said nothing for 6 weeks. She watched. She kept her kitchen warm and her bread reliable, and her observations entirely to herself. She was not a woman who spoke before she was sure of what she was saying. On the morning of the 7th week, Mira came in from the mews to collect the falcon's morning meat. She was moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet energy she always had after a session with the bird, focused, settled, with a small private stillness about her that Agnes recognized as happiness, the specific kind that does not need an audience. Agnes was working bread dough on the long table, her back to the room, and she spoke to the window. "Be careful," she said. "Of the falcon," Mira said, reaching for the wrapped meat. "Of the Duke," Agnes said, "and of yourself, while you are at it." The kitchen was warm, and smelled of new bread and good wood smoke. Outside the window, the first flowers of spring were showing in the kitchen garden. Small, white, persistent things that had pushed through the last of the frost with the quiet stubbornness of things that know what they are supposed to do and simply do it. Mira looked at them for a moment. She knew what Agnes was talking about. She had known it was coming in the way she knew most things that mattered, quietly, from a distance, with enough time for a careful person to see it arriving before it was there. Edmund Hartwell had been visiting the Mews at times that had no practical justification, not always when the bird was being handled, sometimes just in the late afternoon, standing at the fence line, watching training from a measured distance. He had stopped being merely interested in the Falcon's progress sometime in the past few weeks. Cole had noticed. Dorothy Finn had noticed, and had begun moving through the corridors of the house with the careful, contained expression of a woman who has registered something significant and is managing it quietly. And Mira had noticed. She would have had to be a great deal less than herself not to. Edmund Hartwell was not subtle when he was trying to be subtle, which was, she had come to understand, because subtlety was not his actual nature. Precision was his nature. He was a man who looked at things fully and honestly, and said what he found, and his attempts at indirection were visible as attempts, not as successful performance. She had found this to be one of the most reassuring things about him. A man who cannot hide what he feels when he is trying to hide it is a man whose face can be trusted when he is not trying. She had been paying attention. She paid attention to most things by habit, because the years had taught her that the people who noticed things earliest were the people who were least caught by surprise. She had noticed the quality of Edmund's attention over these months, not just that he was paying attention to her, but how he paid it. It was the same quality she brought to the bird, not grasping, not managing, just looking, with the willingness to see what was actually there rather than what he had decided should be there. This was rarer than it should have been. She had worked in houses where she had been looked at a great deal and seen not at all. She had been assessed for usefulness, judged for her work, occasionally noticed for her appearance, and seldom, in any of it, simply seen as a person who had a particular and specific nature and a history, and an interior life that was worth any degree of genuine curiosity. Edmund was curious about her, not in the acquisitive way that made her careful, but in the way that people are curious about things they find genuinely interesting, where the interest is in the thing itself, and not in what can be done with it. She had been thinking about the difference between those two kinds of interest for weeks now, and she had concluded that it was not a small difference. It was, in fact, the central difference. It was the same difference that existed between how she stood at the Falcon's gate and how everyone else had stood at the Falcon's gate. Curiosity without agenda, attention without claim, the willingness to look at something real and let it be real, without pressing it into a shape it hadn't chosen. "He is a good man, I think," she said to Agnes, carefully. "Good men can still cause trouble without meaning to," Agnes said, working the dough with a thoroughness that contained a whole curriculum. "Good does not mean simple. Good men with complicated positions make complicated situations even for the people they mean well toward." "I know," Mira said. Agnes was quiet for a moment, working. Then she asked the question she had been building toward, and she asked it directly, the way she did everything. "What do you want?" she said. "Not what you expect, not what seems likely or sensible. What do you actually want?" It was not a question Mira had allowed herself very often. She had spent most of her working life in circumstances where wanting things was an exercise in disappointment, and she had learned to manage herself efficiently by keeping her wants small and her expectations smaller. She had learned to find her satisfaction in the work itself, in the bird, in the mornings, in the particular quality of a task completed with care. She had not thought very far beyond that. She stood at the kitchen shelf and looked at the wrapped meat in her hand, and thought about the question honestly, the way her father had thought about things, turning it over, examining it from every angle, before he was willing to say he knew what he was looking at. "I want to be somewhere I am allowed to be exactly what I am," she said. It was a small sentence. It was also the largest thought she had had in years. Agnes stopped working the dough. She turned around and looked at Mira with the full attention of a woman who does not turn around for small things. "And is this that place?" she asked. "Parts of it," Mira said. "The bird, the mornings, Cole's teaching. Parts of it, yes. And the rest of it?" Mira looked at the kitchen garden through the window. The small white flowers bent slightly in the morning breeze and straightened again, patient and unhurried. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "I have not let myself think far enough to know." Agnes turned back to her bread. "Think soon," she said. "Before somebody else's wanting makes it impossible for you to hear your own." Mira took the meat and went back to the Mews. She thought about Agnes's question through the morning session, and through the afternoon, and into the evening, when Cole had gone home, and she was alone with the bird in the quiet warmth of the Mews. She sat on the handling stool and thought about wanting, about what she actually wanted underneath all the practical layers, the wanting to be realistic, the wanting to be careful, all the kinds of wanting that were really forms of preemptive self-protection. What she wanted, if she was honest, was to stay. Not to work here, not to be here in the managed and provisional way she had been in every other place. Useful when something needed doing, invisible the rest of the time. She wanted to stay in the way the Falcon had chosen to stay, which was not because it had been caught or trained but because it had decided. Because it had found one place and one person that it recognized as real and had come back to them, across open sky, by its own choosing. She thought, I want what the bird wants. I want to choose, and I want the choosing to mean something. The problem was that a choice like this involved more than herself. It involved a man with a title, an estate, and a position embedded in a set of expectations so old and so deeply structural that going against them was not simply a matter of what two people decided between them. It involved noise. It involved the opinions of people who considered themselves entitled to weigh in on the lives of others. It involved her being seen in ways she was not accustomed to being seen, which was a particular kind of difficulty, because she had spent most of her life being comfortable with invisibility, and becoming visible was not a simple exchange. She was not afraid of noise. She had been quiet through a great deal of difficulty, and quiet was not the same thing as afraid. But she was careful. She was careful because she had seen what happened when people were careless with things that mattered. She would think about it. She would think about it properly, the way the decision deserved to be thought about. 3 days later, Edmund came to the Mews at the end of the afternoon and asked her a question that told her the thinking had already begun on his side too. Are you happy here? He asked. He was looking at her when he asked it, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. Parts of it, she said, the bird, the mornings, Cole's teaching. The other parts are simply work, which is what they are. What would make it more? He said. She looked at the kitchen garden path. I have been thinking about that, she said. And? The answer is complicated, she said, and I think you know why it is complicated. He was quiet. They walked a few steps in silence. Then he said, with the precision that was his genuine voice, yes, I know. Then we probably need a more honest conversation than this one, she said. Yes, he said, I think we probably do. They walked back to the house. The evening was coming on, warm and golden, the long light of late spring making everything look briefly significant. Behind them, in the Mews, the Falcon sat on its perch with the patience of something that has already made its decision, and is simply giving the rest of the world time to arrive at the same understanding. That more honest conversation came 3 days later. Edmund came to the Mews and asked her to walk with him out across the lower field. He had clearly thought about what he wanted to say, and he said it with the directness that was his most genuine quality. He said he was aware of what was happening between them, that he had been aware of it for some weeks, and that he thought she was probably aware of it too. He said he was not asking her for anything at that moment. He was only telling her that he was not willing to pretend he did not know what he knew, because he had found, in the past months of knowing her, that pretending around her was something he was no longer able to do. He said, I respect you enough to be honest with you about what I am thinking, even when what I am thinking is something I have not yet fully worked out. She looked at the field. The long grass bent in a light wind and straightened. Thank you, she said, for saying that the way you said it. You have made it very difficult to be indirect, he said. She almost smiled. I know, she said. I will think about this carefully. I would expect nothing less, he said. They walked back to the estate. The conversation had been short. It had also been the most complete exchange she could remember having with another person. Nothing performed, nothing withheld. Two people telling each other what was true and trusting the truth to be a sufficient foundation. She thought about it for days afterward. Careful, thorough thinking. The kind her father had done before any decision that mattered, turning the thing over slowly in private before he was willing to say he understood what it was. She thought about the walk home that evening after the conversation, the golden evening air, the estate spread around them, the particular quality of the silence between her and Edmund on the garden path. It had not been an uncomfortable silence. It had been the silence of two people who have just said something true and are letting it settle before they do anything else with it. She thought, I have not had many conversations where the silence afterward felt like part of the conversation. She thought about what Agnes had said, before someone else's wanting makes it impossible to hear your own. She turned this over carefully. She was aware that there were forces around her that were beginning to form opinions and expectations, the way forces always did when two people's lives started to intersect in ways that other people found interesting. Dorothy Finn's careful neutrality, Cole's slightly too deliberate discretion when Edmund came to the Mews, the small particular shift in the way the kitchen staff spoke when the Duke's name came up in conversation. She could feel the shape of other people's expectations beginning to take form around the situation. and she was determined to do her thinking before those expectations had a chance to press themselves into the space where her own judgment should be. She sat in her room in the upper quarters one evening, the room Edmund had given her when she was formally appointed the Falcon's keeper, with the desk and the falconry books and the view of the kitchen garden, and thought about what she actually knew, setting aside what other people thought they saw. What she knew, he was a good man. Not a simple one, but good in the way that people are good when they have taken the time to think about what goodness requires and have decided it is worth the effort. She knew that he was lonely, that the estate and the title and the correspondence from London had been building a life around him that was comprehensive and empty at the center. She knew that he saw her, specifically, individually, as the person she was, and not as a category of person. She knew that the thing that had built between them over the year was not circumstance or propinquity, or any of the ordinary accidents of proximity. It was the result of two people who were honest enough to see each other clearly and, having seen, to keep looking. She thought, I trust him. The thought was simple and solid, and arrived without qualification, which told her it was true. She thought about the walk home after that first honest conversation, the golden evening air, the estate spread around them, the quality of the silence between her and Edmund on the garden path. It had not been an uncomfortable silence. It had been the silence of two people who have just said something true and are letting it exist before they do anything else with it. She thought, I have not had many conversations where the silence afterward felt like part of the conversation and not the absence of one. She returned to the Mews the next morning and the morning after. She worked with the Falcon and she worked with Cole, and she did her thinking on the margins of her days, in the early mornings before the handling sessions and in the evenings when the Mews was locked and the estate was settling into its nighttime quiet. She thought carefully, because careful thinking was what the situation deserved. She thought about what she had said to Edmund, the rest, if she wanted there to be a rest. She did want there to be a rest. She had been honest enough to say so, which had surprised her when the words came out, because she had not been planning to say it and had not known she was ready to, until she heard herself say it. This was, she thought, one of the marks of honesty. It sometimes surprised the person being honest, because it outran the careful management of self, and arrived at the truth before the management could intercept it. She thought about what it meant to want something large. She had kept her wants small for most of her adult life, and this had been practical and correct, given what her life had offered. But practical management of limited circumstances was not the same as knowing what you actually wanted when circumstances changed. She was finding that she had to learn, almost from the beginning, how to want on a scale that matched what was actually being offered. It was an unfamiliar sensation. It was not entirely comfortable. It was also, she noticed, not frightening. She examined this and found that it was because the wanting felt grounded. It was connected to something real she could see and evaluate and trust, not to an idea or an impression. She was not wanting Edmund Hartwell because she had constructed a picture of him and fallen into the construction. She was wanting him because she had watched him for nearly a year at close distance, in small moments and insignificant ones, and what she had seen had been consistent and clear and genuinely good. She thought, I am going to say yes. When the autumn conversation comes, I am going to say yes. She thought about this for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days the thought was the same, had not shifted or developed any qualifications, and she accepted it as settled. She went on with her work. She did not change anything about how she moved through the estate, or how she spoke with Edmund when they crossed paths, because she was not yet at the moment that required anything different. The summer was ahead of them. He had asked for the summer and she had granted it. She would be honest when the season turned. She was, in the meantime, exactly where she was, and where she was, she had concluded, was somewhere she was allowed to be exactly what she was, which was, as it turned out, enough. In the second week of June, Cole found Edmund waiting outside the Mews at the end of a morning session. He had come earlier than his usual hour, and he had stayed at the fence for the last 20 minutes of the session without saying a word. Cole took the Falcon inside, settled it, and left the two of them in the field without looking back. He had been working around this situation long enough to recognize when a space was needed, and when his presence was the wrong thing in it. Edmund walked across the grass to where Mira was coiling the lure cord. She kept coiling it, because she was not the kind of person who stopped what she was doing because someone important had arrived, and Edmund had, by now, come to depend on this about her the way you come to depend on solid ground. I would like to ask you something, he said. All right, she said. He asked it in the way he did everything when he was being honest, plainly, and all the way through. He asked her to take a formally appointed position as the Falcon's keeper, with proper wages and a different standing in the household. He said this offer stood entirely on its own terms and was sincerely meant regardless of anything else that existed between them. He then said there was an anything else, and named it plainly. He had found himself, over the past months, wanting her company and her conversation and her particular way of being in the world, with a consistency and depth that had nothing to do with the bird, and everything to do with her. He was not asking her for anything beyond permission to continue being honest about it. The rest, if she wanted there to be a rest, was a separate conversation for when she was ready to have it. Mira finished coiling the lure. She held it in her hands and looked at the elm trees at the field's edge and thought about her father, who had understood that you do not rush things that matter, because rushing them is how you damage them. She thought about Agnes's question and the answer she had found, and about what it meant to be somewhere you were allowed to be exactly what you were. She thought about whether this was that place, whether this was the person who would make it that place. Yes to the position, she said, and yes to the honesty. I would like there to be a rest, when the time for that conversation arrives. Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man who has been holding something for a long time, and has just been given a reason to believe he may not have to hold it alone. The time for it is whenever you are ready, he said. Then give me the summer, she said, and we will talk in the autumn. The summer, he said. I can do that. He walked back toward the house. Mira stood in the field for a moment after he had gone, holding the coiled lure and looking at the elm trees at the field's edge. She thought about the word she had just said, rest, as in, the rest of it, the part beyond honesty, the larger thing they were both aware of, and neither of them had named directly yet. She thought about the fact that she had asked for the summer, which was a form of trusting herself, trusting that she would know her own mind by the time the summer was done. Her father had never made a decision he was not ready to make. He used to say that a decision made before you were ready for it was not actually a decision. It was a surrender dressed up as a choice. She had believed him then. She believed him still. She walked back to the mews. Cole was inside. Cole was inside, and he looked at her when she came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them said a word, and the falcon on its perch turned its head toward her with that old, familiar compass needle precision, and she put the lure away and sat on the handling stool and held out her arm, and the bird stepped onto it, and the two of them sat in the quiet warmth of the mews while the summer afternoon went on outside, without requiring anything of either of them. Cole kept his word. He noted the bird's progress in his handling log every day, and the log had never been so full or so interesting. He began, toward the end of July, to leave Mira alone with the falcon for portions of the handling sessions, not because he did not want to be there, but because he had understood that his presence was sometimes a layer between the bird and what it was doing with Mira, and the best thing he could do, professionally, was remove the layer and let the thing be what it was. Mira handled these solo sessions the way she handled everything, without making a performance of the solitude. She worked through the exercises Cole had taught her. She tried things that were not in any textbook, small variations that suggested themselves naturally, and that she would report to Cole afterward, sometimes finding that they confirmed what he already knew, and sometimes producing something new, that he noted down with the expression he wore when a student had said something he had not thought of. She was becoming, over the course of that summer, a falconer. Not in the sense that the title required years and formal training and the recognition of the profession. She was still that too, still learning, but in the sense that mattered, which was the sense in which you become the thing you are doing when you do it with your whole self over a long enough period of time. She was becoming someone to whom the care of this bird was as natural and necessary as breathing, and the bird was becoming something she could not imagine her days without. She thought about this sometimes. She thought about how she had come to Ashcroft without anything she could call hers. No family, no certain future, no particular claim on anything beyond the day's work. She thought about what it meant to have arrived, a year later, with the bird and the work and the room in the upper quarters and the desk with the falconry books and the view of the kitchen garden. She thought about what it meant to be in the middle of becoming someone, and to feel the becoming happening in real time, rather than reading about it afterward. She was grateful. She kept this quietly, the way she kept most things, because gratitude expressed too loudly tends to make the thing you are grateful for feel managed, and she did not want to manage any of it. She simply held it. She thought about Edmund walking beside her in the summer afternoons on the way back from the mews, the long grass gold at the field edges, the estate spread around them both. She thought about the quality of his attention, and the fact that she had come to look for it, which was new for her. She was not accustomed to looking for another person's attention. She was accustomed to working around the absence of it. She thought, something has changed in me this year, not because of him specifically, although he is part of it. Something has changed in the general direction of being less afraid of what I actually am. This, she thought, was the thing worth keeping regardless of anything else. Dorothy Finn saw the change in the household accounts when Mira's new wages appeared. She said nothing, and kept everything she thought carefully to herself. Agnes, when she heard, nodded once and went on with her bread. They had both been watching long enough that the confirmation of what had been building produced not surprise but a quiet settling, the feeling of a thing having arrived where it was always going. The summer that followed was warm and long and useful. Edmund noticed himself changing in ways that were not dramatic, but that accumulated. He woke earlier. He dealt with correspondence promptly. He visited the tenant farms directly instead of through his estate manager. He was better at his work when he was not spending himself on the maintenance of distance. Distance is expensive. He had not understood, until he began closing it, how much of himself it had been costing. The Falcon grew in confidence week by week, and its speed across the lower fields became something that people came from neighboring estates to watch from the fence line. Cole said it was the most significant progress he had seen in a working bird. He said it was not the training alone, though the training had been good. He said it was the quality of the relationship between Mira and the bird, which he had no technical term for because it predated technique. Mira heard this and said nothing. The Falcon had always been what it was. She had always been what she was. What happened between them was simply what happened when two things met without agenda, and found, without planning it, that they could coexist honestly. She thought about this sometimes in relation to the other thing developing in her life, the thing she had asked for the summer to think about. She thought, compatibility is too small a word for what I feel when Edmund Hartwell is in the same room. Compatibility is the word for things designed to fit. What she felt was older than design, more like the bird stepping across the mews floor. A movement made because the movement was right, and for no more complicated reason than that. She kept returning to a single simple thought: I trust him. It did not require qualification. That told her it was true. On a Tuesday morning in early September, Mira took the Falcon on the longest free flight they had yet attempted. Full sky over the wooded ridge at the estate's northern edge. It went up and out and became briefly invisible against the September clouds. Then it came back. It dropped from its height in a long, controlled descent and landed on her arm with the certainty of something that knows exactly where it is going. Cole watched from the field's edge with his arms folded. Edmund watched from the garden wall with his hands in his coat pockets. The morning air had the particular quality of a season that is about to change. After the flight, after Cole had taken the Falcon back to the mews, Edmund came down from the garden wall and met Mira on the path. The summer is ending, he said. I know, she said. They looked at each other in the September morning light. I am ready for that conversation, she said. The bird stepped onto it, and the two of them sat together in the quiet warmth of the mews while the summer afternoon went on outside. Dorothy Finn saw Mira's new wages in the household accounts, and made no expression, and said nothing, and that evening drank a full cup of tea at the kitchen table before bed, which was more than she usually allowed herself. Agnes watched her drink it and did not ask questions. They had both, in their different ways, been expecting this long enough that the confirmation of it felt less like a surprise than a settling of something that had always been moving toward this point. The summer passed in the way that good summers pass when you are doing work you value in a place you are beginning, carefully and tentatively, to think of as yours. Mira and the Falcon made their hunting flights across the lower fields. The bird's confidence grew week by week. Its speed became something that people came from neighboring estates to watch, standing at the fence line with their hats in their hands. Because a Saker Falcon at full hunting speed is the kind of thing that reminds you, without any warning, that the world contains capabilities far beyond anything human beings invented or can fully explain. Edmund watched most of these flights from a distance. He was keeping his promise. He was giving her the summer. He had found, to his considerable surprise, that this was not the difficulty he had expected. Waiting for something you were genuinely certain of was a different quality of waiting than the waiting he had done most of his life, which had been for things he was not at all certain of. This waiting had a solidity to it. It did not feel like absence. It felt, if anything, like building. He spent the summer being honest with himself in ways he had been putting off for several years. He thought about what he actually wanted the estate and his life to be. Not what his father had built, not what the county expected, not what the London correspondence implied he should be managing toward. He thought about loneliness in the specific way you can only think about it after you have been given a clear view of its opposite. He thought about a girl who had stopped at a gate in the dark with an ash bucket, and asked nothing from a creature that had nothing left to offer to anyone who asked, and in doing so had given it the only thing it actually needed, the experience of being seen without demand. He thought, I know what that bird feels like. I have known for some time. On a Tuesday morning in early September, Mira took the Falcon on a free flight across the upper field, longer than anything they had attempted before, the bird given full sky over the wooded ridge at the estate's northern edge. It went up and became briefly invisible against the gray morning clouds, and then it was back, dropping from its height in a long controlled descent, settling on her arm with the certainty of something that knows exactly where it is going and why. Cole had stopped holding his breath during these flights weeks ago. He watched this one from the field's edge with his arms folded and his expression quiet, the expression of a man who has watched something he helped build become something better than he thought it would be. Edmund watched from the garden wall. His hands were in his coat pockets. The morning air was turning. Autumn was at the edges of things. After the flight, after Cole had taken the Falcon back to the mews and Mira was walking back across the field, Edmund came down from the garden wall and met her on the path. "The summer is ending," he said. "I know," she said. They looked at each other in the September morning light. "I am ready for that conversation," she said. Autumn arrived the way it does in England, not all at once but in increments. A cooler morning, a yellow-tipped leaf, the angle of the light changing in a way your skin registers before your eyes do. The kitchen garden changed. The field grass went gold at its edges. The rooks on the stable roof became noisier, which Agnes said always meant weather coming, and Agnes was not wrong about weather. Edmund came to the mews on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October. He came at the time he had taken to coming during the summer, mid-morning, when the session would be finishing. Mira saw him through the mews window and knew from the particular quality of his arrival, the deliberateness, the way he waited at the gate rather than coming in, that the summer was officially over and the other conversation had arrived. She settled the Falcon on its perch. She told Cole she would be a few minutes. She walked out to the gate. "Autumn," she said. "Autumn," he said. They walked to the lower field again, because that was their field by now, the field where they had both said things that mattered. The elm trees were burning, gold and copper and rust, the brilliant brief burning of things that cannot hold their color and do not try to. The air had the particular sharpness of October mornings, clean and cold and without ambiguity. Edmund spoke carefully and completely. He had spent the summer thinking about how to say this, not rehearsing it but being honest with himself about what he actually meant, so that when he said it he was saying the real thing, rather than a managed version of the real thing. He talked about what he had come to understand about himself. He talked about what he wanted. He talked about what it would cost her, the things he could protect her from and the things he could not, and he named the difference between those two categories without reducing it. He said that the people around him would have opinions. He said that some of those opinions would be loud and persistent. He said that he would stand beside her in all of it, and that the standing beside her was not a promise of smooth weather, but a promise of company, in whatever weather arrived. He told her what he was asking. He asked her to marry him. The elm trees made their small October sound in the still air. A crow crossed the sky above the far tree line, going somewhere with the calm purposefulness of creatures that do not doubt their direction. Mira stood in the field and was quiet for a long time. She was not performing thought. She was actually thinking, which has a different quality to it, a fullness, a turning over. She was thinking about her father's hands on the neck of a horse that had decided to stop being afraid. She was thinking about the first morning at the gate, the ash bucket heavy and the bird pale and still in the gray light, the tilt of the hooded head toward her, as though it had been waiting specifically for her and not for anyone else. She was thinking about whether Edmund understood what he was asking, not in the legal sense or the social sense, but in the sense of what it actually meant to ask another person to build a life with you. She had decided, over the summer, that he did understand. The evidence was in the quality of his attention over these months, the way he had kept his word, the way he spoke about things without softening them, the way he had looked at the difficulty clearly rather than looking past it. He did not need her to be anything other than what she was. That was the whole of it, really. That was the foundation of the answer. "Yes," she said. The word was plain and even, the way her voice always was. No performance of joy, no relief spilling over into display. Just the word, meaning exactly what it said, offered with the same completeness she brought to everything she considered real. Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the expression she had become familiar with over the year, the expression of a man who has understood something he had been working toward for a long time, and is finding the understanding both simpler and more significant than he expected it to be. "Thank you," he said. "You do not have to thank me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to anyway." They stood in the October field together. The elm trees burned around them, brief and brilliant. Above the field, somewhere beyond the far tree line, a bird called. one of the common winter birds returning to the estate for the season, which happened every year at this time without fail, the reliable return of things that had decided this particular patch of ground was worth coming back to. "It will be noisy," Mira said. "Yes," he said. "People will say things. For a while." "Yes," he said. "And then they will either stop or they will not, and we will live in whatever remains when the noise is done." She looked at him, he looked at her. There was nothing between them that needed managing or constructing. There was just the fact of it, clear and solid, the way real things are. "Then we will live in it," she said. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked back across the field toward the estate, and behind them, the elm trees went on burning in the October light, quietly and without asking anyone's permission. Dorothy Finn cried in the kitchen garden for half an hour when Edmund told her. She arrived at breakfast the following morning red-eyed and composed, and no one in the household said a word about either condition, which was the household's way of showing respect for things that mattered, without making a performance of the respect. Agnes received the news with a single nod, and went on with her bread. She had been making bread in this kitchen for many years. She would continue making it regardless of what else was happening in the world, because the bread required her attention and she required the work, and between them they had an arrangement that needed no audience and no one else's understanding to remain valid. Cole sat outside the stable that evening with his pipe and thought about the day he had held a piece of meat through the gate slats and watched a bird that had injured 3 trained professionals walk calmly across the floor of its own mews to eat from a kitchen girl's open hand. He thought about what it meant that the bird had chosen, and whether the Duke understood what he was getting in a person who could produce that kind of trust in a creature that did not give it easily. He had decided, somewhere around August, that the Duke did understand. The evidence was in the quality of his attention, in the way he had kept his word through the summer, in the way he spoke about Mira when he spoke about her at all, with a specificity that was not about possession but about genuine recognition. You cannot choose well what you have not first seen clearly. Cole smoked his pipe and listened to the mews and went to bed. The weeks between the answer and the wedding were not quiet weeks. The county had opinions, as Edmund had said it would. 2 families wrote letters. One neighbor came in person and said things that Edmund listened to politely and did not debate, because debating them would have granted them a weight they did not deserve. His solicitor arrived from London with concerns, and Edmund listened to those too, and addressed the ones that were legitimate and set aside the rest. Mira moved through all of it the way she moved through everything, steadily, without making a performance of steadiness. She was not unaffected. There were mornings when the weight of other people's opinions arrived in the mews with her and sat on the handling stool beside her, and the bird, with the instinct it had always had for what she was carrying, would step from its perch and come to her arm without being called, and the 2 of them would sit together in the quiet until the weight was manageable again. She talked to Agnes. She talked to Cole when there were things she needed to think through out loud that benefited from the perspective of someone who had watched the whole year unfold with clear and honest eyes. She did not, in the middle of all of it, stop being herself. This was, she thought, the point of the whole thing. Not to survive other people's noise by becoming smaller, but to remain large enough to be worth returning to. Edmund came to her one evening in November, looking tired in the way that people look tired when they have been dealing with the outside world for many hours in a row, and need the company of someone they do not have to manage themselves around. He sat down in the mews on the second stool that had appeared there sometime in August, and looked at the falcon on its perch. "How is the bird?" he asked. "Well," she said. "It caught its first rabbit last week, without any lure work. Just saw it, and went." He smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind that arrived without warning when he was not performing being pleasant. "It will be a remarkable bird," he said. "It already is," she said. He looked at the falcon for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Truly?" "Truly," she said. "I know what I chose. That makes the rest of it manageable." He nodded. They sat together in the mews in the quiet of the November evening, and the falcon breathed steadily on its perch, and outside the wind came up in the elm trees, and it was simply a good evening to be somewhere warm with someone you trusted. The wedding date was set for December. The preparations were simple. Edmund had not tried to make them large, and Mira had not asked for large. She had asked, when he invited her to tell him what she wanted, for it to be honest and quiet and real. He had said, "Those are exactly the qualities I am best at providing." She had, for the second time, almost smiled at something he said. He counted this as progress. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cold, with frost on the flagstones of the estate chapel and a fire inside that had been burning since before 5 in the morning, to give the old stone walls time to warm. Edmund had stood at his study window the night before for a long time, looking at the estate in the dark. The fields, the mews, the garden wall, all the complex and demanding and beloved territory of his life. He had thought about what it had been before this year and what it was becoming, and the difference between the two things was so significant that he did not have adequate words for it, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on precision. He thought, a year ago I was managing this place. Now I am beginning to live in it. He went to bed and slept soundly, which was something he had not done reliably for several years, and which he considered, in its quiet way, to be as significant a change as any other. The small gathering arrived at the chapel in the December morning. Dorothy Finn, who had promised herself and then broken the promise and was now simply accepting the fact of her own feelings with the dignity of a woman who knows when she has been defeated by something bigger than herself. Agnes in her working dress, standing at the back with her chin up and her hands folded. Cole in his best coat, holding his hat, looking at the space with the expression of a man who has seen something through from its beginning and is now at its first arrival, and feels the full weight of the distance traveled. Mira arrived with the Falcon on her arm. It was unhooded. She had not planned it that way. The morning's feed had run into the time of the ceremony, and she had not wanted to leave it alone in the mews when the household's routine was disrupted, and the sounds of an unusual morning were moving through the estate. The bird stood on her arm through the brief ceremony, with the alert, golden patience it had been building for a year. It did not startle, it did not move. It simply stood on her arm and was exactly what it was, which was all that had ever been asked of it. Edmund watched her with the Falcon the way he had watched her from the first morning, with complete attention, with the recognition of something real. When the moment came for them to face each other, she shifted her arm slightly, and the bird adjusted its feet with the small, automatic grace of something that has learned to trust the body it stands on. He watched her do it, and felt something that he did not have a name for, and did not need one. There was no performance. There never had been. That was the whole foundation. The ceremony ended. Cole held the door. Edmund offered Mira his arm. She transferred the Falcon to the travel perch Cole had brought, smoothly and efficiently, with the same movements she used every morning. Economical, caring, automatic with the ease of things that have become second nature. She settled the bird. She checked that it was comfortable. Then she turned and took his arm. They walked out of the chapel together and into the gray December morning. The frost was on the path before them. The elm trees at the end of the garden were bare and very still. The estate spread out around them in all its complicated, demanding, familiar reality. The fields and the mews and the tenant farms and the long correspondence and the fencing repairs and all the other things that did not pause for any occasion, however significant. It did not look like the world had changed. It looked exactly like the Ashcroft estate on a December morning. Frost on the ground, rooks in the stable eaves, smoke from the kitchen chimney because Agnes was already back at work, because the bread did not wait and Agnes had never once in 30 years asked it to. But the quality of standing in it was different. Mira could feel it, the particular way a place feels when it is yours, not owned, not managed, not temporarily occupied, genuinely yours, chosen as much as it has chosen you, the way the Falcon had chosen to come back across the open sky that first Tuesday morning in March when it could have kept going and had not. She thought about what she had said to Edmund months ago in the autumn field. You cannot hold something that does not want to stay. You can only give it a reason to come back. She had found her reason. She had come back. They walked together down the path toward the house. Behind them, in the chapel, the Falcon stood on its travel perch in the thin December light. It waited until the sound of their footsteps on the frost path had faded. Then it turned its head. That old movement, that precise compass needle tilt, in the direction Mira had gone. It held the position for a long, still moment. Then it settled its feathers and closed its eyes and rested. It rested with the deep, uncomplicated rest of a creature that has found, after a long time of refusing everything offered to it, the one thing it was actually willing to keep. It had not been caught. It had not been managed into staying. It had made a choice, in the way all genuine choices are made, not from pressure, not from the absence of alternatives, but from the clear recognition of something real. It had recognized something real in Mira Boss before anyone else did, before the estate did, before Edmund, before Mira in some ways had given herself permission to recognize it in herself. And it had waited, with the extraordinary patience of something that does not doubt its own perception, for everyone else to arrive at the same understanding. Outside on the frost path, Mira and Edmund walked toward the house. The day went on around them, ordinary and irreplaceable, the way all days are when you are finally somewhere you have chosen to be. The kitchen chimney smoked. The rooks settled. Somewhere above the elm trees, a wing crossed the wide gray sky, briefly visible, then free, then part of the larger air that held everything. The house waited. The fire was already lit. They went in.